right now. If you look at the back wall here, we've got a lot going on. One of the pieces of this is this string, and what we've been representing with that string is eternity. That if you go into eternity past, or if you go into eternity future, it's a very, very long time because eternity is just really long. But the second thing that we've seen in this is that in time that we're captured in right now in this moment, in this black dot, what we see is all of human history. And from the very beginning of the end of it, there are some significant things that are happening. And in the scope of all of eternity, you and I are living not in this black dot, we're living on like a fiber of the thread that's in there because we are existing in such a short period of time. But it's significant because you and I are thinking, hey, we're living and we're significant people. We're important. And so we're trying to figure out what is our place in the broad scope of eternity, what's happening right now. And in this series, what we've done is taken the Bible and we've kind of broadened it into a big macro kind of level. And we've been trying to piece together what are the significant things that are bringing us to present day and then even into the future. And as we do that, one of the big things that we've noticed over the last 3 weeks, if you haven't noticed, we're kind of stuck on a theme. Like we did 400 years at one point, we did 700 years at one point, we did all of eternity past in 1 week. And so we've been moving pretty fast, but all of a sudden we got stuck on this one person of Jesus, the Lamb of God and the Messiah. And we've been stuck on Jesus because at the very least, he is the linchpin, or he is the hinge upon which everything into eternity past and eternity future resides and hangs on. And so Jesus becomes a very, very important person. But not only is he an important person as far as the roles and things, I mean, we've talked about the Messiah, he's the priest, he's the prophet, he's the king, all these kind of parts about him. Today we're going to kind of dive into his life, and we're going to look at just a period of moments, a period of actual sentences that he is a part of and speaking. And so instead of looking at him as a person and a position, we're going to look at his life. So if you've got a Bible, I would encourage you to turn over, and I wish I would have just brought like a bunch of Post-it notes, because I'm trying to contain it to 3 passages. So Matthew 26, Luke 23, and John 19. So if you've got a Bible, I would encourage you to open 3 tabs on your phone, 3 places in your Bible. Matthew 26, Luke 23, and John 19. Because here's what we know about Jesus, and here's what we're getting to, we have to build it up to. First of all, we know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's kind of just a Christmassy, like, hey, we know this. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. For 3 years of his life, it basically went by without anything being known about him. It just kind of happened. And then all of a sudden, at 30 years old, for 3 years, we've got the book Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and it just fills up with conversations, with discussions, with events, with activities, all these things related to Jesus. And so in an effort to simplify this, what we're going to look at is the not most important, that's hard to say, to try to say these are the most important things that happened in his life, and they all happened towards the end of his life, and in fact, they're his famous last words, as it were. So what we're going to do is last words. I've got some random people's famous last words because I just like to Google things. And so here's some people that I thought were interesting. Richard B. Mellon, his last words were last tag, and he was an entrepreneur, he was a multi-millionaire. He could have said a lot of different things, but he said because for his entire life with his younger brother, he'd been playing tag with him. And so right before he died, he tagged his brother, and for like the next 20 years before his younger brother died, his younger brother was it, because you can't tag a dead guy in account. So that's his last tag. We've got this guy, we've got Leonardo da Vinci, and he said, I have offended God and mankind because my work did not reach the quality it should have. Well, it's a very humble type of a statement. I've not created anything like Leonardo, and I would like to think that I'm something, but yeah, there's Leonardo's last quote. We also have Groucho Marx, No Way to Live. Fits his personality a little bit. This is No Way to Live was his last words. Gustav Mahler, a composer, died in bed, and he was conducting, I don't know if he was out of his mind, but he was conducting an imaginary orchestra, and his last word was Mozart. That's where his heart was. It was in music. It was in his role model, Mozart. Raphael. Let's go to Raphael. His last word was happy. And I look at that picture and I don't see it. But to each his own. Famous last words, happy. Last one, Joseph Wright. Joseph Wright was a linguist, and he helped write some of the English dictionary. And so, again, fitting, his last word was dictionary. It's interesting. I don't know, like, if you were to think about it through your lens, if you had a famous last word, if on your bed you said, hey, this is what I wanted to say. I don't know if you've thought about that before. I have not. What would your famous last words be? Anybody have anything off the top of their head? It's at least an interesting question to think about. I mean, Elijah, go ahead.
What's this? Papa!
Elijah, that's fitting. I like it. Cindy? I'm coming home. Okay. Vicky?
No more dieting.
No more. I like it.
Amen.
Andy?
I always think of another one bites the dust.
Another. Oh, wait, that's a different song. What did you say, Harold? Amen. So be it. It's really interesting. I mean, you think of these people, and they're well known, and they have something in their heart, and that's kind of the last breath that they have something that they want to communicate, and they do so. And so what we're going to see today is Jesus in his last words is really going to communicate what's in his heart, what he's passionate about, what he's here for. And so instead of looking at 3 years of his life, I backed it up. I backed it up about, 2 or 3 weeks of Jesus' life. And I came up with, you see John 13:17 is an entire quote by Jesus. So we're not going to do all that today. So I did it, and I narrowed it down to about the last 12 hours of Jesus' life. And just for your sake, I usually have about 3 or 4 pages of notes. This number right here is an 8. And so what my plan is for today is until you guys start falling asleep, or until we start having Super Bowl thoughts, we'll just cut it out, and we'll see if we even get past all of them, but I doubt that we will. So my perspective is, let's take our time, let's dig into this, and then when the bell rings and Sophia wants to go home, we will just quit. But here's the significance of this, is that when we look at Jesus' last words, what it's doing is it's like an echo, again, throughout history past and into the future. And that what he is saying is significant, not just for the people that are hearing these words, but they're significant for us today. So we'll start with the first one. These are going to be in chronological order. Matthew chapter 26, verse 63. And to give you some sort of context to this first quote that we're going to be looking at, Jesus had spent the evening with friends, and they were celebrating the Passover. So it wasn't like hey, we're just doing this drudgery thing. It was this big celebration. Everybody in the nation was celebrating the Passover, and it was a celebration. It wasn't like this, oh man, we have to do this again. It was a great thing that he was with his best and closest friends, and he was able to celebrate. It's like we're going to have a birthday, and we're going to have some candy and candles, and we're going to celebrate this. And he's doing this with his friends on the eve, or on the 11th hour kind of a deal, of him being killed. And before he dies, he's celebrating. In this celebration, there are some very, very difficult conversations that were had with his closest friends. You think about what he talks about with Judas and with Peter. His closest friends, he says, hey, you're going to betray me, both of you guys. And he calls them out, like, on the carpet. Like, that's not like the conversation that you normally have at birthday parties, hopefully. But that's a hard conversation that he was having with his closest friends. I think that they were probably sluggish. They were probably not quite all there, because they had just eaten a huge meal. They'd celebrated for hours on end. And then at that point where they were full, they're now leaving this place, and they're going on a walk over to this Garden of Gethsemane. And for the next few hours, Jesus spends it, and he's praying in the garden. He prays with such fervency that even medical and scientists will say, man, if you are this burdened over something, of sweat coming out of your body, you can have blood coming out of your body. And Jesus was that passionate in his prayer time that he was sweating blood. And then you see that he comes back to his friends 3 different times, and his friends are sleeping on him. As he's praying, his friends are sleeping. In the middle of the night, this is happening. Again, one of his closest friends, Judas, comes and betrays him with a mob. A mob of people come up from the city of Jerusalem. They take Jesus, they bind him, and they take him away in the middle of the night. We don't know exactly what time it was, but I'm guessing that it was probably between like midnight and 3 o'clock in the morning. And so Jesus has been awake for a long time at this point. And Jesus in the early morning is taken before the Sanhedrin and the religious leaders of the day, and these people are questioning him over and over again. What have you said about this? What about this? And they're trying to trap him in some sort of thing so they can convict him of being guilty, so they can get him off the scene. And so for hours he's being questioned. And in Matthew 26, verse 3 and 4, what we see is the context of what's taking place here. It says, then the chief priests and the elders of the people assembled in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus in a treacherous way and kill him. They were trying to find a way to be able to get rid of Jesus. And so they finally get a hold of him. He's before them. They're questioning him. And for most of this conversation, Jesus just remains silent. Doesn't offer a defense, doesn't have a conversation, just remains silent. And I think that they get so frustrated that you finally see this quote in verse 63. Jesus kept silent, it says. The high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. He's just overwhelmed because Jesus is responding. And he says, tell us if you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And the first quote Jesus gives is, you have said it. Jesus told him, but I tell you, in the future you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. Quote number 1, you have said it. What he's saying there is not a sarcastic kind of a response. The way that he's saying it is just an affirmative. Yes, I am the Messiah. And he confirms the position. He is the Messiah. And that's significant because as we look at all of the Old Testament and what it's building towards, and this prophet and this king, Jesus is just recognizing and saying, yes, I am stepping into this role. The person that you guys all know should be coming, I am that guy. And they're trying to get rid of him and kill him, but he's saying, no, I'm fulfilling all these prophecies. And not only does he say, yes, I'm the Messiah, but he goes even one step further and says, I'm God. I mean, you look at what he says in the second part of that, he's coming, you see that the right hand of power coming on the clouds. That's not like that's like a Mary Poppins kind of thing. Like that's not a normal thing for anybody to say. And the response of the high priest is obviously understanding, hey, he's not the Messiah at this point. He's saying that he's God because what the high priest does in response is he tears his clothes and he says, in the next verse, he says, we have to do something with this guy. We have to kill him because he's claiming to be God. Which, ironically, if you want to take a note of it, in Leviticus 21, verse 10, it says that the high priest and the priests were not supposed to tear their clothes. So by them that thing, they were disobeying the law that they were trying to convict Jesus of. But Jesus claims that he's the Messiah, and he claims that he is God. We can't underemphasize this enough, that when you go through the New Testament systematically, when you read what Jesus says, Jesus is not a God. He's not a creation of God. He's not just a kind of as an example of God. He's not just a good man. Jesus claims over and over to be God. There's no gray area in that. And that's the reason religious leaders wanted to kill him. On top of that, Jesus promises in this quote to come back. And I think that this is interesting because the high priest in this situation is the position of authority. He's saying, Jesus, I'm standing over you as judge. You have to answer to me. But Jesus says, no, I'm going to come back. And in me coming back, you are going to be under me. I am going to be in that position of authority. And the tables are going to turn on him. The priest will be confronted with Jesus' return. All of a sudden, instead of the high priest kind of pointing his finger at Jesus, Jesus is going to say, no, you're accountable now and responsible before me. And the theology of this quote is deep. You get into the end time stuff, you get into the deity of Christ, you get into his position and his work. But the application for us, I think, is simple. It's take comfort. Because as Christians, what we have to understand is that as Christians, we are going to go through affliction. We're going to go through suffering. And sometimes when we go through that suffering, we feel like we're by ourselves. We feel like we're on our own. You look at 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 4 through 7, and in this paragraph, it's a beautiful thing. I would encourage you, again, take note of it, turn to it, whatever you want to do. But here's what it says. It says, "Therefore we ourselves boast about you among God's churches, about your endurance and faith in the persecutions and afflictions you endure." The persecutions and afflictions. Because it is clear evidence, the afflictions you're going through, it's clear evidence of God's righteous judgment, that you will be counted worthy of God's kingdom, for which you are also suffering, since it is right for God to repay with afflictions those who afflict you. I think about that. Jesus is in a place where he's saying, I'm going through suffering, but he realizes in that quote, hey, I'm coming back and I'm going to be in a place of authority. And I don't have to worry about right now because I'm going to be justified in my position. And for us as Christians, we have to understand the same thing, is that as we go through affliction, God is going to come back and he is going to repay justice, and he is going to be justified in doing so, that our suffering is for nothing. He is going to take our side. At the very end of that, in verse 7, it says, "This will take place at the revelation of the Lord Jesus from heaven." So in the same quote that we see Jesus saying, I'm coming back on the clouds, that's included in us, is that Jesus is going to be vindicated, but we as his believers, through the suffering that we're going to be vindicated as well. We're part of that. There's peace in that. There's hope in it. You go into the second quote that takes place here in Jesus' life, at the end of his life, in Matthew 27, verse 11. Because Jesus claims to be God, the priests want Jesus dead. But at the same time, they're handcuffed by the Roman Empire because they're not allowed, or they're not able to put Jesus to death the way that they want to. And so they have to, and they're kind of forced to go to this guy named Pontius Pilate, who's the leader of the region. And they go to Pilate, and they go, I think, grudgingly, because they hated Pilate. Pilate was not their friend. And Pilate hated the Jewish people. And so the Jewish people are kind of like handcuffed, and they say, well, I have to go to Pilate. I don't want to, but we want Jesus dead, so we've got to work with him. So I think they wait for probably an hour or two until daybreak. They kind of wait for his alarm clock to go off, or Pilate's alarm clock to go off. And Pilate wakes up, and the first thing he hears is, hey, you need to come and look at this guy, Jesus, because we need to take care of him. And wait for Pilate to look at him, and Pilate wasn't a fan of the Jews, and he takes his time and he questions Jesus for a long time, for a very long period of time. And Jesus does the exact same thing he did to the religious leaders. He kind of just remains silent. He doesn't respond to very many things at all. And after silence for most of the conversation, asks a question that Jesus decides to answer in Matthew 27, verse 11. It says, "Now Jesus stood before the governor," referring to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" the governors asked him. Jesus answered, "You say so." If you look at the New King James Version, if you look at the New American Standard Version, it clarifies. It says, "It is as you say." It is a clarification because he's just affirming. He's saying, yeah, I am the king of the Jews. I am in this position. He claims to be king in the face of a present authority. You think about that. I mean, just in a really weird scenario, you walk into the White House, President Joe Biden comes down the stairs, and you say, I am the president. And he says, I don't know what he would say, but I mean, it's just going into the face of somebody that you're taking the position that they already have. That doesn't make any sense. And Jesus says, no, I am the king. You think that you're the king? You think that you're in charge here? I'm the king of the Jews. I think of Tom Petty. Who doesn't think of Tom Petty? I thought about putting a picture of his long flowing hair back in the day, but that would be distracting, so I won't do that. But Tom Petty, I won't back down, right? You can stand me up at the gates of hell, but I won't back down. You know, like it's just that whole thing over and over. And that's exactly what Jesus is doing. He's saying, hey, I'm standing up to a person that could easily kill me right now, and I'm not going to back down from the position that I have. I am the king of the Jews. Yes, I'm the Messiah, but part of that being the Messiah was being in the place of authority. You keep going, John chapter 19, verse 11, the third quote that we see at the end of the life of Jesus is just a continuation, something that is added left in Matthew what he says to Pontius Pilate. He says, not only I am the king of the Jews, he says, you would have no authority over me at all. Yeah. Jesus answered him, if it hadn't been given you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. Again, this is gutsy. He's going to Pilate on his ground, on Pilate's ground, and says, I'm the king, and you would have absolutely no authority if it wasn't given to you. You have no position here. Pilate has no authority on his own. He has authority, but the only reason that he has it, Jesus says, is because God gave Pilate the authority over Jesus. Now just think about this in the context. If Jesus really is God, if Jesus really is the King of the Jews, if he really is the Messiah, if he really is the Lamb of God, all those positions fit for Jesus, but he says, I am still not the top dog here. The Father is. And the Father has decided to put you, Pilate, in a position of authority over me. I can't even think of a good illustration for that. Because there's not very many times where the person that is the best qualified and the best suited and the most powerful person in the situation gets a subordinate role. Maybe you've experienced that in your job or in your life where you're like, hey, I deserve to be up here, but there's this one person that's really annoying that's right in between me and success. And Jesus is saying the reason that I'm down here instead of in this position of authority is not because it's unfair and because it's unjust and I hate it. It's because, no, I am entrusting myself to the Father. You look at that last part of that quote, and it's really interesting. He says, this is why who handed me over to you as the greater sin. In some ways, he's advocating Pontius Pilate and saying, Pilate, you're not. It's somebody else who has the greater sin. And the three ways that you could look at this is, first of all, it could be referring to Satan as God's adversary is working against Jesus and trying to have him killed. I don't think that's likely in this context. I think the other two are more likely. The second option is Judas. That he's referring back to Judas, that Judas was the one responsible for handing him over. And you see even in that awkward conversation between Jesus and Judas, and Jesus said, it's better for you, and he doesn't say this behind his back, he says this to Judas, it's better for you to not have even been born at this point. That's a harsh statement to somebody, hey, because of what you're about to do, it would have been better if you would have never been born. But I think most likely in this context, what he's referring to is he's referring to the high priest again. He's going back to Caiaphas, and he says, it's better, that greater sin that was accomplished was through that high priest. He says in that quote, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. There's going to be a time, there's going to be a reckoning where the high priest at that time is going to stand before Jesus, and Jesus is going to say, you handed me over to Pilate. And he's going to have to answer, Caiaphas is going to answer to Jesus, not to just God, but to Jesus, the one that he handed over. And I just want to stop there because we have no agenda today. And I want you to think about this. Like when Caiaphas gets judged by Jesus, there is going to be a specific reason for that judgment. And I think sometimes in our Christian circles or Bible or sometimes we think about hell, and we think about hell as kind of just this generic place where if you're bad, if you don't do this, you just kind of get thrown into hell for whatever reason. What we see in this verse and throughout the Bible is that hell is not a generic judgment from God. God judges people based on specific criteria. If you miss that in the Bible, you're missing a lot, because in 2 Peter chapter 13 and in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 20 and 21, those verses are 13, 20, and 21. There are people who are being judged specifically for their actions. Hell experience is going to be very unique from other people's hell experiences. That should be in some way, as we're talking about hell, that should be in some way a comforting thought. That God doesn't just slap on judgment just for the sake and fun of judgment, but he looks at individual people and says, because of what you've done, because of what you haven't done, you are judged. There's strict and reasons for the judgment that God gives. And what we wind up finding out is that the only reason that you are put into hell in the first place is because of your rejection of the offer of salvation of Christ. That really it's all about having your trust in Jesus as your person. That's the qualifying factor. But off of that two spectrums, if you're saved or unsaved, God isn't just like putting a duct tape on you and saying, well, I guess you're just whatever. God sees you and sees your heart and sees what you do. In Caiaphas, there was a greater sin. There was a spectrum of stuff, and it was a greater sin than other people's responsibility in this matter. Any questions, any thoughts so far? I like pausing and letting us shake it off a little bit. Yeah, go ahead.
So, are you saying that your hell, like my hell would be, not I'm going there, but it would be tailor-made for me, like all my worst things. That's what my hell would look like.
It doesn't give like here's what each individual is like, but what we do see is that hell is going to look and feel different for different
Because
people.
I mean, they specifically say, like, for the angels, they would, until judgment by God, they would put them in a dark cave.
Yeah. And that isn't hell referring, like that would be kind of a
That would
holding
be-
cell
okay.
until, because what we're going to see is that hell synopsis or comes together at the end of the Bible with the great white throne judgment. But what we are going to see, again, in 2 Peter, let me turn over there really quickly. But in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 13, there we go, 2:13, it says, they will be paid back with harm for the harm they have done. So instead of here's a generic thing, it's you've done this, and so there are consequences for that. And what we see is like that's a theme throughout the Bible, right? Like it's you go to the very beginning, the world was broken, not because of some random thing. It was God had a rule, and there's a consequence for that. Like for example, I've got kids. If my kid comes to me and says, "Hey, I ate a snack that I wasn't supposed to eat," I'm not going to nail them to the wall or nail their door closed so that they can never get out of their room again. That's not an appropriate consequence for the crime that they've committed. There's an appropriate consequence. God is well aware of that, and God is well able to give consequences. And we are looking at this in the negative way because Jesus' quote is, hey, there's the greater sin here. But we see it in the exact same way on the flip side, right? That if we are saved, God is not just going to give blessing and glory in the same way to every single person. He tailor-made your heaven experience, which a whole lot to say about that, but your heaven experience, who you are and to what you've done in your life. Now, again, at the nuts and bolts, like there's almost two pie charts here, or two like kind of nucleuses here. And the nucleus of hell is separation from God. The nucleus of heaven, which gets missed, is with God, presence and relationship with God. And everything bad is because you're separated from God. Today, like the sun is out, the sun is shining, it's a warm day, like that's a great thing. And that's just a little tiny sliver of heaven. Like that's neat. Like we get to experience heaven on a tiny little bit. Your relationships, your friendships, your family, that's a tiny little sliver of heaven because that's what God has created and it's something good. And so hell starts with separation of God, and heaven starts with a relationship with God. Oftentimes in religions and all sorts of ways that we think about heaven, we think about like this oasis where we're chilling on the beach and we have a drink in our hand and we've got all these good things. But we're missing the fact that heaven isn't primarily about like comforts and pleasures and like good things. Like it's about a relationship with God because God is enough and God is good. And so it's a mirror image where we get to Jesus and Jesus is saying, I want to bring you back to this enoughness. I want to bring you back to this goodness. And I know you've separated and broken away from this, but it's so good that I want you to get back to heaven with me. There's no experience in heaven. This is the last thing because this is a rabbit trail. There's no experience in heaven where you or I will be apart from God. Heaven in itself is with God. All right, I'm done talking about that. Anybody else have questions? One
thing that's a question, but I don't know if there's an answer for it. But one thing I wanted to just jump on what you were saying. David's last words to his son, so we're talking the last words,
Yeah.
were know the God of your father. And the word know is yada,
Yeah.
which is the same
Close,
Genesis
intimate.
4:1. Yeah, I mean, it's how Adam and Eve had kids.
Yeah,
They knew each other.
yeah,
So God's talking about an intimacy, you know. David's last words were, be with him. I mean,
yeah,
with him.
yeah,
you
that's
know,
great.
And that's heaven.
Yeah,
Right? But then my question is, I love what you just said about the idea that Caiaphas's own person is
Yeah.
having the person he handed it over say, you got it wrong. It was me. I was the Messiah the whole time.
yeah.
You know, right? And he's left with that. My question is that public? Do we see that? Is every act of, you know, I think about people that have suffered incredible trauma, right? And that part of their heaven experience, if you will, is the idea that there is justice.
Yeah.
They will have closure. Is that public for everyone, or is that just public for them, or is it not public at all? It's just between God and, sorry, it's just a question.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
obviously it's not there.
Yeah.
You know, but you want every individual that, you know,
Right. And I think that's,
extreme injustice to see that justice happen.
yeah. And I would just really quick go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 4 through 7. Read that a few times. Like, soak in that, because at the heart of that is you're going through suffering, like you're a victim here. God sees that. God is going to repay the people that have harmed you, but He's also going to heal you. And there's just an amazing thought that I don't know what that's going to look like, but there's this reality that all those wrong things that have happened in the past, things that are behind closed doors, all those things, God doesn't miss. God's going to take care of it. There's a beauty in that. Did you have something else?
I wanted to point out the fact that every one of us will stand God.
Yeah.
So,
That's what I was thinking as far as
it
Bruce's
doesn't,
question.
doesn't matter
Yeah.
if you're been good or not so good, but each of us will stand before God.
And I think that, again, an opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just strictly an opinion.
Sure.
Yeah. Did you have something? Okay.
Okay, so
We've got weeks and weeks and weeks. Not today. We've got weeks and weeks in the future.
so along the lines of just for hypothesis, the one that he's referring to here is who has handed you over has the greater sin. I've heard it said, I've not studied it on my own, but it said that those who had more opportunity to know God, right, to receive salvation, to accept Him, that is in a sense like the greater sin, like the level or degree of hell will be more severe as opposed to someone who hasn't had as much opportunity. Does that sound like, is that a similar concept here? Is his greater sin the fact that he has had the scriptures and had access but still rejected God?
I thought it was someone who turned their back, knew God and then turned their back.
Well, I think about when they talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, and they're like, you now who knew me and knew that I was the Messiah versus those in Sodom and Gomorrah will face harsher. So I think that, like,
A lot of the context of this idea of greater punishment, it always seems like it connects, because even the reference in Jude that I think towards with Sodom and Gomorrah,
yeah.
like it's almost always connected back to some sort of leadership position or teacher position.
Gotcha.
So like in 2 Peter, it's talking about those who do harm to others. Like if you've got any sort of a platform whatsoever, if you're a dad in a home, if you're a pastor like me, if you're like in a teaching position anywhere else, and you kind of got this authority, hey, I'm saying this as of God or as like a leading,
Okay.
like there's all of a sudden more on you because you're the one that's kind of directing not just yourself but the other people too.
Okay.
So I would have to check into specifically that
Yeah.
idea of exposure, but I think that it really does tie back into leadership.
Now, can I read
Go for it.
first, second?
No, you can't read the Bible here. Go ahead.
But you're
Sorry.
saying what Peter said. For if, after they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they again entangled in them and overcome, then the latter end is worse for them than the beginning. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered to them. But it sounds like it's worse, like she's saying, those that have heard opportunities gets and all that,
Yeah.
it's gonna be worse.
Yeah.
That's part of what I read out of Peter.
So again, there's a long rabbit trail that I was
Oh,
expecting,
yeah.
but no, I just want to pause there. Like, for us that are in this room, like we need to be aware of the fact that there's consequences for knowing and not responding. There's consequences for hearing the gospel and not doing anything with it. And again, like we've got so much in our culture that says you got to do this, you got to know this, you got to like simplify it down. Like I've got a friend who said, here's the gospel in an ADD form. He's an ADD guy, and so he's like, perfect. We're not perfect. Jesus died. Do you believe him? That's where it's at. And if we reject that, like there's consequences. There's consequences. I enjoyed that.
What was the Second Thessalonians quote once again?
Thessalonians 1, 4 through 7.
Thank you.
Yeah, 2 Thessalonians 1, 4 through 7. All right, I want to try to hit one, maybe two more. We'll see how this goes. Luke 23, verse 28. Luke 23, 28. The context of this quote is that Pilate doesn't really get anywhere with Jesus. And so that's the end of that quote. And so Pilate's like, what do I do? So he knows that this guy, he's not friends with him, but he's also a Roman authority. Herod is in the town for this big celebration thing. So he's like, Jesus, I'm going to send you over to him. And Herod's excited because he's like, well, maybe Jesus will perform like a magic trick for me kind of a deal. And Jesus doesn't answer Herod. He doesn't talk. So Herod gets frustrated. And so he abuses, mocks, tortures Jesus. And then he sends it back to Pilate. He's like, I didn't get any fun or whatever. And so I'm going to send it back to Pilate. Pilate doesn't want to do anything with Jesus. He wants to let him go, but he sees this mob kind of coming around and really pushing for Jesus to be killed. So he washes his hands and says, this isn't on me anymore. This is on you guys, the mob, because the mob always knows best. And so he hands him off to the mob after he flogs Jesus within inches of his life and sends him on his way. And they give him probably about 100 pounds worth of wood. It's this cross beam for a cross. And they set it on Jesus' tattered, torn, bloody, bruised, destroyed back. And Jesus has to carry anywhere between 60 and 100 pound log up this hill towards Golgotha. In the context of this, as he's walking with this beam, it's Luke 23, verse 26 and 27. It says, as they led Jesus away, they seized Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming in from the country, and laid the cross on him to carry behind Jesus. A large crowd of people followed him, including women who were mourning and lamenting him. And so, there's thousands of people in Jerusalem. It's packed. And as this is happening early morning, what's happening is Jesus is walking, and the streets are just lined with people, and women are lamenting and crying and bawling for this man who's being killed. Luke 23:28 is the quote from Jesus. It says, but turning to them, Jesus turns to the women as he's going up this hill. Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. Look, the days are coming when they say, blessed are the women and children, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry? It's kind of like an out of place kind of quote. Like you're like, what prompted Jesus to all of a sudden, instead of being on his road up to the cross, like turn to these women and talk to them, engage with them? But the first thing that we see in this tribulation is coming. Like it's not just this bad thing that's happening now, but there's going to be something in the future that is going to be way worse. That there's a tribulation, obviously, with him and what he's going through, but there is going to be a greater tribulation. And I think there's a reference there to just all the the monstrosities that the Jewish people have gone through over the years with the Holocaust and with the Inquisitions and the persecution all over the place. But I think that there's even a greater reference there to this great tribulation that we're going to get to. And we're going to look at that in Daniel, tribulation that is coming. And he's saying, hey, at some point, things are going to get so bad that people didn't have families, that they're going to wish that they were dead because it's so full of a time. I think about that embodiment, it says in John 1:14, of full of grace, full of truth. He caused people in his graciousness and in his truthfulness, he caused people to hate him so that they wanted to torture him and kill him. Jesus, the perfect representative of the perfection of God, caused people to want to kill him. And then I look at us and I say, I'm not the perfect representation of Jesus. How much worse is it going to get the longer Jesus, last part of his quote in verse 3, do these things when the wood is green, referring to Jesus being right there with him. After Jesus is gone, time has gone on, there's going to be things that happen. If you want to know more about this tribulation that's coming, read Matthew 24 and 25. It gives some details of it. But I'm just reminded of this idea that after thousands and thousands of years, persecution, suffering, things are going to happen because Jesus is no longer here. And the longer that happens and the longer that we kind of keep promoting Jesus, people are going to continue to push back on Jesus, back on his followers and say, we don't want to have anything to do with him. 19 says this, Jesus quoted again, he says, this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. That's our society, that's our culture, that's our world. Right now, people see Jesus, and they say, no thanks. I don't have anything to do. The next quote is in Luke 23 as well. You go a few verses down, and it's in verse 34. After being awake all night, walking, after being tortured, mocked, spit upon, put a crown of thorns, Jesus makes it to the top of this hill, the place of the skull, Golgotha. At about noon, a beam that he was supposed to be carrying up the hill was fitted together with a longer beam to make a T. After the cross was constructed, his bare, bleeding back was forced down upon it. And most likely is shoved into the beam, and it continues to throb and bleed, and his arms and his legs are bound to the beams. His wrists and feet, now secure, have a trained muscular Roman guard hammer nails the size of daggers through each of his appendages. With many men lifting probably the 300-pound cross, they set it up slowly and carefully so that it fits into the hole and probably drops at least 3 feet into the ground. The next thing that we see Jesus say is in verse 34. The next thing that we see him say, Father, forgive them. Man, you think about that. Like the first thing I would be saying on the cross, if I had any breath or energy left at all, I mean, that's not what I would be saying. But he says, God, forgive them. Because Jesus understood how sinful, how strained humanity is. You think about Isaiah chapter 53, verse 6. All of us, like sheep, strain, have wandered away. You look at Romans chapter 5, verse 10. It says that we are enemies of God. And yet Jesus says the only way for these wandering, selfish, silly little sheep that are enemies of mine to have any sort of forgiveness is to go to the Father. He knows where this forgiveness is going to go. And he died even when they're consumed with temporary little things like his clothes on the ground. Jesus knew who to go to for forgiveness. And he was fighting for people even at his grave. He was fighting. He was fighting for me. He cared. He loved us. And Jesus willingly forgave those who actively killed him. It wasn't just like, hey, I think of Michael way down the road, and I really love Michael. It was, no, these people that just shoved nails and thorns into my body are the people that I want to forgive. Now, you just stop there for a moment, and there's way too much to think about. Because the first thing I think of is, if he would forgive them, there's no possible way that he wouldn't forgive you. If he's actively forgiving the people that and spitting on him and making him look like a fool, I look at my life and I say, but there's this thing in my closet that I don't want anybody else to see, and I don't want to have to deal with, and I don't want to have to bring out, because if I were to bring it out, God would look at me and say, no way. And Jesus proves a point here with his quote to us right here, right now, is that if Jesus would forgive them, there's nothing that you could possibly do that would cause God to say, no, I'm not going to do it. I don't want to just skim past that, because oftentimes that's our biggest thing, right? Is that we say, well, God could never love me because, or I can never be forgiven because of this. And so in our heads, we either go to the victim, pathetic mentality of saying, hey, I can't do anything, and so I'm not worthy of it. Or we go to the other side and we say, well, we're going to become religious, and we're going to do this, and we're going to try to do this, and we're going to build our life and be really impressive. And in either situation, it's a dead-end street. The only option for us is to be right where we're at and hear the words of Jesus, where he says, forgive them, because they do not know what they're doing. He understands where you're at. He sees you where you're at. He says, I'm willing to forgive you. I'm willing to forgive you, but the response on our part is belief. That we have to believe that he is with us. Believe that he actually did forgive us on the cross. Because again, our mentality is to go one way or the other, and we miss the simplicity. I had a conversation with a friend this week, and he was saying that, like, what it means to believe is complicated. Believing is a really complicated, what does it really mean? Does it mean this or this? Just stop and think of any other situation in your life when you say, hey, I believe you. I trust that that's real. I sticked my key in my car today, and I believe that it was going to turn on. I turned on the water today because I'm an American and I have water in my home. And I turned on the faucet, and I believe that it was going to come out. We believe in so many things, but then all of a sudden we get to Jesus and we say, well, we got to go to church, we got to do this, we got to do that, or I'm not good enough for it, or I'm not that. It's belief. I can't, I don't know how to articulate belief any more than it's just trusting that Jesus did something for you, and I believe it. It's not complicated, but we make it complicated. Because at the end of this, this quote, and as we're getting into the next part of this, is that the cross was about God pursuing you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. And it wasn't about me pursuing him. He chose to reach out to you, and so now it's our response of faith. The cross was about God pursuing us, not the other way around. This is a great breaking spot. Jesus is singing on the cross, offering you forgiveness, and for us in this room, we have to make a decision. Do I believe Jesus died for me? Do I believe that he really did, that he wants to forgive all of my sins? Because as soon as I decide I'm going to trust him, all of a sudden our slate is wiped clean. Forgiven. That's an opportunity for each one of us here in this room. Have you ever put your faith in? Because if you haven't, right now, it says in the Bible, right now is the time of salvation. Today is the day to make that decision. The second part of this, I wasn't planning on this being the personal health side of this, but this is the personal health for today. Who are you holding on to and not going to forgive them because of that? Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. Some of us are like, I can't forgive them because they knew what they were doing. Yeah, but we still, as Jesus followers, have a responsibility, and if that's not enough to say, hey, you should forgive this person, for your own personal health, we know this probably over and over again. Like, we are broken people that pile onto our brokenness when we decide we're not going to forgive people. Bitterness, anger, hate are not happy ways to live, but they're also just detrimental to your health. So I can give you lots of like science little things, but here's my thought. Forgiveness needs to be common within Christians.
Amen.
The church is sometimes the worst place to be. Like I've been at places in churches where it's just like, this is the worst place to be. A lot of that stems back from us not being willing to forgive. Not all of it. I know that there are things that other situations, but forgiveness is a key part of this.